Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming to our third webinar in our series. This particular webinar is called How Do You Make Your Research Matter to Policymakers and Practitioners? This webinar is aimed at those who aren't sure how to make connections among different constituencies or how to translate research to policy or practice, as well as how to identify the right audiences and how to reach them with an effective message. For that reason, we've taken great care to identify people we think might be effective at addressing these questions. Before we introduce the panelists, I just want to give an overview of this hour. We're going to introduce people and then ask each of our panelists to talk about a success in terms of the research and policy connection. And then we will have a series of questions that have been prepared beforehand and ask one of the panelists to address that question, check with the other panelists to see if they have anything to add, and then we will open it for Q&A at the end for your questions and comments. So let's begin. I am Richard Sprott. I am a developmental psychologist. I teach in the Department of Human Development and Women's Studies at California State University, East Bay. I also run a couple of community-based research organizations. And I'm also past president of Division 44, the Society for the Psychology of Sexual Orientation and Gender Diversity. I was president in 21-22. Jackie White is an emeritus professor of psychology at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. Before retirement, she was active in APA and is a past president of Division 35. She's also an APA Congressional Fellow, so we're grateful that she's contributed some of her retirement time to working with us on this policy project. Mary KOSS is a Regents professor in the Mel and Edith Zuckerman College of Public Health at the University of Arizona. She published the first national study of sexual assault among college students in 1987, which is the subject of a book, I Never Called It Rape, that Ms. report on recognizing, fighting, surviving date and acquaintance rape in 2019. The story of this work is featured on National Public Radio's This American Life. In 2022, she published a 30-year prevalence comparison in new national data that demonstrated sexual exploitation occurs even more frequently now than then. Her ongoing work evaluates a sexual assault bystander prevention program, focusing on staff of alcohol-serving establishments, safer bars. She was the principal investigator of the Restore program, the first restorative justice program for sex crimes among adults that was quantitatively evaluated. Recognizing the mismatch between victims' perceived post-assault needs and what policymakers envision as their scope of service, she advocates for victim-centered, trauma-informed resolutions outside the criminal legal system and as a component of a comprehensive menu of post-assault services. Lieutenant Nick Grant is a board-certified clinical psychologist and currently serves as the embedded mental health officer for Commander Naval's Surface Group Middle Pacific, where he oversees the mental health programming for ships that are home ported in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Nick is a fellow of the APA, including 7 of its divisions, a past APA Congressional Fellow from 2016 to 2017, where he served in the office of U.S. Senator Kirsten Gillibrand and a 2023 Fellow of the Atlantic Fellows for Health Equity program. Dr. Steve Newell joined the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy in June 2022 as the Assistant Director for Innovation and Equity on the Science and Society team, where he leads the Subcommittee on Social and Behavioral Sciences of the National Science and Technology Council. Prior to coming to OSTP, Steve was a project director at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, where he helped launch the Center for Scientific Evidence in Public Issues. He was an AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow from 2015 to 2016 with the Office of Senator Bernie Sanders, and the National Institute on Minority Health and Health Disparities from 2016 to 2017, where he focused on healthcare access and quality and health equity. Steve has worked at the intersection of science and policy since 2012 across a wide variety of areas, including health, criminal justice, science and technology innovation, artificial intelligence, and election security. So welcome, everybody. Thank you. We're going to start with just a brief example, something that from your work that you think of as a success, to give an example and an illustration for people to have in mind as we address the following, the subsequent questions. So I'm going to ask Mary to go first on your policy success.
Okay, I made a picture show, and that's because I need to tell you a story as if I were an Olympic athlete, where I had a couple of big successes when I was in my 20s, and I have spent the rest of my life working as hard or harder, trying to come anywhere near close the level, even though I've trained very hard. What I'm known for is what I did when I was 20. So I'm not sure, are you seeing slides on a screen at this point?
It's just starting.
Okay. All right, terrific. So each slide is going to advance automatically in 12 seconds so that I can't talk too long. This is the 1987 study on which my medal is based. I had done work before this study, and it had gotten picked up in the media. Here's 84. You can see that date rape started out as a term in quotation marks, which means it's a questionable term. And you can see again in the New York Times in 1985. So those were the attempt to say, okay, we'll get you some unassailable data. The study I showed was written with a professional writer as a book that has never been out of print, and you can see has had impact everywhere, even though it's extremely old data. APA got me the opportunity to testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee when it was chaired by Joe Biden. Being a Midwestern girl, I thought it was an important occasion, so I should dress up. And I thought Gold LeMay was a perfect choice to appear before the Judiciary Committee. As you can see, my son was at this committee hearing, and afterwards he said, "Mom, that was extremely boring." And I had to say to him, "Kiddo, that's as interesting as life gets." I'm just going to have to tell you right now to prepare yourself. So here's my letter from Joe Biden, which acknowledges that this work did end up leading to the passage of the Violence Against Women Act. So what did I do in the meantime? That was my success. Now what have I tried in the meantime? The last one was to try to go down against the American Association of University Professors' work to provide a counter narrative to universities who were underestimating their problem. what's showing to you now are pictures of various op-eds or keeping in touch with journalists that have written kindly about my work to try to keep it in the public forefront. And this picture is obviously in front of the White House. And it is right in the Eisenhower building, where we tried to lobby the Department of Education for a 2-word change that we didn't even get a 2-word change. I think this is second last. I think it's important to keep your message out there. So that's happened. Here's a Michael Bloomberg funded summit on violence prevention. And I managed to make my point by wearing a blouse that accidentally fell off my shoulder. So, there's like a trend in I get my policy success through wardrobe choices.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you very much. Nick, would you please talk about a policy success?
Of course. I don't know how to follow that, Mary. That was super amazing. And I'm very jealous of all the photos. That was very brilliant to bring that to the presentation today. I want to share an experience I actually had when I was an APA Congressional Fellow. So it's been a few years. This happened in July 2017, but it was a really meaningful one. And I think it highlights that policy successes, especially as they relate to research impact on policy, is not just having a policy pass, which is very important, but sometimes, and I will use the term circle of trust for the 100+ folks that are here, sometimes it's making sure the stupid policies don't get passed too, right? So as you may remember, back in 2017, the then president proposed a ban on military service for transgender people. At that time, I was working in Senator Gillibrand's office, specifically on her military legislative team, as well as her healthcare legislative team. And based on my background in LGBTQ+ health, I kind of handled any issues for that more minor portfolio. When that issue arose, the senator had already been kind of the champion of supporting transgender Americans serving in our United States military, but she was really upset, as many of us were, by this tweet that said that this was no longer going to be possible. So I was charged by the senator and her staff with bringing in research from the psychological perspective to draft a letter to the then Secretary of Defense. My collaboration really focused on reaching out to my connections as well as professional organizations. So I reached out to folks within APA, within Division 44, from the National Center on Transgender Equality, to make sure that I was including the most up-to-date research that we had on transgender health and mental health, and opposing this ban that was based on just discrimination in and of itself. What that actually led to was a 2-page letter. It's available online. You can easily Google it. I did that in preparation for today. And it was then a sign-on letter that we socialized throughout the Senate to get other folks to sign on to. Very common practice to have to gain support, to build power from the Senate. But what is so unique about this experience was the deadline for this letter was in late July. You might remember when the late Senator McCain voted down to protect Obamacare. So it was happening on that night. So the entire staff was in the office. I think it was like 1 a.m. And I could see on C-SPAN my senator walking around from person to person with this letter. And as you might suspect, in the context of the government, things need to be very well formatted. I'll never forget when I accidentally misspelled a senator's name. I had to redo all the signatures and everything, but it was a good learning lesson. So anyways, everyone's name is formatted and spelled correctly on this form. The senator was walking around the Senate floor, taking this letter to her colleagues and getting folks to sign literally in the margins of the letter. This is something I had never seen before. And it was very personally meaningful because I'm sitting there watching C-SPAN in her office, seeing her do this boots on the ground sort of work with her peers. It resulted in 44 senators signing onto this letter. It had bipartisan support, and it went to the then Secretary of Defense. The result, of course, this was a piece of a larger kind of approach to oppose this ban. There was a quote unquote ban put in place, but it was not the outright ban that was initially proposed via Twitter or whatever it's called these days. So I share that to say it was the inclusion of research amongst many, many people. I was just in the position at that time to bring that together and put a little bit more of a barrier in bad policy moving forward.
All right, thank you very much. Steve, what about a policy success that you have seen or been part of?
Sure. I winced a little bit during Nick's story because I know how onerous the signatures aspect can be. Having to redo those is a special punishment. So I just want to say up front that I'm here in my personal capacity and I'm not speaking on behalf of the Biden-Harris administration. So I also want to say, you know, right now we're in an incredible moment for research and evidence mattering to policymakers and policy. From the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act of 2018 until today, we've seen a flurry of legislation and administrative actions aimed at making research and evidence a bedrock component of policy. The Biden-Harris administration in particular has worked tirelessly to achieve this through actions like the president's memorandum on restoring trust in government through scientific integrity and evidence-based policymaking, and its public access memo and subsequent commitment to open data and science. So as we talk about our experiences in making research matter to policymakers, it's important to remember that policy doesn't just take place at the federal level. So prior to my current role here at OSTP, I spent about 3 years working to bring research and policy to state and local policymakers on a variety of issues, including election security. So in response to growing interest in internet voting over the past few years, or which is referred to as sending marked ballots electronically in some cases, I worked with a number of colleagues across a number of scientific societies and election security and voting nonprofits to put together a science brief and open letter that we shared with every governor, state election director, and secretary of state in the country. This shared and amplified research that demonstrates that we don't have the technology necessary to securely and accurately vote online, and helped prompt future conversations with those officials and offices about how to best expand ballot access across the country and maintain security. So this particular effort came prior to the 2020 election and helped ensure we didn't have a critical mass of unverifiable ballots, which could have resulted in chaos. Instead, we had the most secure election in American history. So I would consider that a policy success, although that has not stopped the conversation about the 2020 election in some places. So I'm very excited to talk about a lot of these issues. And yeah, again, following Mary is pretty hard. That's amazing work. I'm still stunned at her work over her career. So thanks so much for Mary and Nick for their experiences as well.
Thank you. Thank you. So we're going to go to our planned questions. And the first question I'm going to address to Mary first, and then ask the other panelists if they have anything to add. What have you learned policymakers most want to hear about your work? What are the hooks that led to their interest, their buy-in? Conventional wisdom is that affecting policy, you need to be nonpartisan and try to reach a breadth of policymakers. Given that you work on what some see as controversial topics, how have you navigated political waters? How did you decide which policymakers to approach? Mary.
Okay, well, first of all, I need to give a shout out to APA, because both of the times I've testified before the Senate, APA arranged those, and then I was able to go in as an official spokesperson for the organization, which I felt put a lot of weight behind the testimony. And also in theory then makes you a nonpartisan person, but in reality, you're invited by one side of the aisle or the other as a witness. And so generally you become politicized no matter what you do. I'm laughing to myself because Steve said he's interested in AI, and I have no perspective on myself. So I have been learning Bard, Bing, and ChatGPT, and I ask all these questions to artificial intelligence. And so I put it in the toolbox because it spits out exactly what I should use as hooks to get people interested in my work and, you know, what might the controversies be and so forth. Very interesting output. But the only problem that it left out was you have to have a door to walk through to give this information. I asked it like, well, what politicians would be interested in hearing from me? Keeping in mind that there's like, what, 673 members of the legislature, something like that. It gave me 5 names that would be interested in anything related to restorative justice for sexual exploitation, or pretty much any other matter, sexual exploitation, the military, justice for it, just everything. And one of them was Gillibrand. So, and the other one was Jackie Spears, who Jackie worked with when she was on her fellowship. So that's really been the biggest problem in having a policy impact within the sexual violence area, is there are so few opportunities when related issues are in the spotlight. And also because I think, you know, like every other organization, I mean, APA has had to strip down, and, you know, as a result, I don't think that they're able to do as, you know, be quite as on top of what's going on and who can we match, and, you know, how can we keep APA out in front of policy advocacy.
Steve, Nick, do you have anything to add to that question about hooks to buy in, or anything to try to capture attention?
You can go ahead, Nick.
Okay, thanks. I would say my general approach or general thoughts when I talk with folks about this, and I think this was really highlighted through our narrative sharing so far, is really about how you're connecting with that person, regardless of like what position of policy making they're in, that to themselves on a personal level, as well as the priority level. And that's what I always tell folks. I think the general model that we see, and APA has trainings on this, is right. Like, you want to come in with your priorities, you want to come in with an evidence base for those priorities, and you want to come in with a connection. You want to make sure that you can connect this in a personal way and make it a real life, like a lived experience that you can share to connect to that individual. I think thinking more broadly about that is going in knowing that you still have that foundation of what you're trying to do, but making connection to the priorities of the member or the policymaker, whoever that may be, because you want to convey to them the impact of whatever policy change you're going for is, and what that's going to have on their constituency, and what cost it's going to have. When I say cost, I don't just mean finance. Of course, everything comes down to the dollar at the end of the day in many contexts, but what it's going to come down to the cost of systems, and what the cost to their people, right? The more personal and the more humanized we can make our asks, our reaches, I think the better we are at developing that relationship, which will then sustain the relationship. The other thought that I had was, there are kind of stages when I think about it, of like an initial meeting or an initial cold call or outreach, is like you're building allyship, and you're really working towards building sponsorship. So you're building that relationship from an infancy stage into a partnership. And then in order to sustain that relationship, which I know I'll talk a little bit more about later, it's really about making sure that the relationship is mutually beneficial, that you are bringing in your priorities, but you're connecting it again to exactly whatever they're working on. Because, right, if we talk about health as a general topic, we're going to make sure that connects to maybe their priorities are in like prison reform. So we need to really interconnect these to make sure that they see that there is an interconnection and there is going to be impact on their priority areas.
Yeah, I'll go and jump in. Yeah, I would echo all of that. I think those are excellent points. I think in terms of identifying who to contact, I think policymakers, you know, both the executive branch and the legislative branch, they're oftentimes very clear about what their interest and priorities are. Leadership and lawmakers, you know, are oftentimes speaking about these. You can identify a lot of members who are at least related to your priorities by looking at, you know, things like congressional committees and seeing who's on those committees, reaching out to those committees, paying attention to things like advisory committee meetings at federal agencies, can provide some insight into at least the conversations that are happening there. I think those are excellent things to keep in mind. One great point I thought Nick made was really emphasizing the connection between what what you're talking about and what your research is on, and what those stakeholders are interested in. When I spent time in science advocacy, talking about the value of funding the science agencies, when I was going to House Republican offices who I had not spent a ton of time previously with, I knew those offices were very interested in deficit reduction. I knew a lot of the work that's going on, the social and behavioral sciences are helping us deliver programs more effectively, helping people pursue information about their health earlier on in the health process, so we're not detecting cancers later. That reduces cost, that lowers the cost of a lot of these national health programs that are oftentimes the largest drivers of these federal expenses. So thinking about these priorities that these offices have, these are oftentimes things we all share in terms of pursuing health and economic opportunity. These are things that are broadly shared. So the more you can relate your work back to how it's pushing these outcomes and these priorities forward for those offices, I think oftentimes you can find common ground. And the more you can reduce the cognitive and kind of work demands of the folks you're engaging with, the better. So if you're in there talking about your work and basic or applied setting, oftentimes it's very helpful if you can directly relate how that kind of connects with a particular program or policy. The less you're asking folks to do on their end, the better it is for them, the more likely they are to think about the connections between your research or evidence and the thing that they're trying to do. So the more you can kind of build the bridges for them and connect the dots, I think that oftentimes makes it more appealing, as opposed to sometimes folks have many meetings throughout the day and you're just one. They have to think about all of the connections afterwards and do all the research. The more you can kind of do that work on the front end for them, the easier it is for those folks.
Thank you. Jackie.
Okay, great. Yeah, we're going to move on to the second question. And I'm really very excited about this. As a member of the planning committee for this entire webinar series, we had to come up with these questions months ago before we even had our presenters confirmed. So I actually am very excited about how we nailed it in terms of this next question. It follows so perfectly from the comments. And Mary has talked about the challenges when there might be so few people, policymakers, who are interested in your topic. Nick and Steve both talked about the importance of finding the hooks, trying to find the common ground. So I think this next question really just flows perfectly, that we'd like to hear each of you say something about the strategy that you think worked best for you. What's been the nature of your relationship with policymakers? Maybe you could say a little bit about how you made contact with the policymakers. How do you maintain that contact? How often do you make contact? In other words, let's just dive a little bit deeper into how in real world and real time you pull these things off. And I do say, from having been a fellow myself, it is a long slog. And Nick, let's start with you, and maybe you can pick up where you left off.
Awesome. Thank you, Jacquelyn. I actually, I'm a talker, as you might all be able to tell, but I have two examples that I'll try and quickly go through. One is a kind of a personal example, or an individual example, I should say. So when I was still in DC a few years back, I was really interested in LGBTQ policy as it related to the District of Columbia. And so I went to look at to see what opportunities there might be to volunteer, like my service, or get involved in community. And I came across this opportunity in the mayor's office. The mayor of DC has an advisory committee on LGBTQ+ issues. And I literally, like, my strategy was Google. Like, I just went online and went to see what was out there that was kind of an intersection of my interests. And I ended up just doing a cold email and reaching out and being like, I don't really understand how this process works, but I'm interested in knowing more. I will be honest, I think it was a couple of emails over a period of time before I got a response. But I eventually did. And I actually was contacted. I think I probably shared my CV or something about my background. And they reached out and said, that committee is full, but we have another committee on, I think, community violence that specifically wants somebody from the LGBTQ+ community to come talk about specific needs of that community as it relates to violence that occurs in the community. community, will you come in and kind of like interview for this position on that committee? So I did do that. And then what ended up happening based on that interview is they punted me back to the larger committee and put me on that committee. So I ended up as a member of the mayor's LGBTQ plus advisory committee for the District of Columbia. That the contact again was like literally a cold email and being very, very patient and trying not to be too pestering with multiple follow-up emails. And then it resulted in my kind of having a seat in that committee advising policy development for the local community. So again, it was like identifying my interests and looking for opportunities in the policymakers' office and what they were doing in that area. This was like a little bit more organized. So there was like a direct path there, although it was the punching back and forth. The other example that I will briefly share with you all is actually one that happened about 45 minutes ago, right before this webinar. In my quote unquote free time, I sit as in the seat of president of a national LGBTQ plus nonprofit called GLAMA, Health Professionals Advancing LGBTQ plus Equality. And this organization is a health professional organization. It's multidisciplinary and it's really focused on LGBTQ health. We were contacted specifically by Senator Hirono's office. And so right before this webinar, I had a meeting with staffers from her office, from her health and health team and legal team, specifically to talk about what's going on in the country around gender affirming care. And so I share this example with you because I think it highlights really my affiliation, similar to what Mary was saying earlier. My affiliation with a larger organization really brought that opportunity or created that opportunity for us to be invited to the table to help inform them in strategy. They were really asking about strategies about how they could get more involved in supporting and protecting gender affirming care from a federal level. Having done hundreds of these meetings as a congressional fellow in the past, I was like, okay, I know how this is going to go. They're going to ask for resources and like, maybe we'll email and we'll never see them again. But the staffers were like very specifically interested in this meeting this morning about like, how can we continue this conversation? How can we continue to resource share? And I liken it to power building within a community context. Like they are really taking a new approach. And it may be because it's a senator from Hawaii and Hawaii is a very community focused region, but they were really taking that community involvement approach of bringing people together to build power to advance the senator's priorities based on the needs of the community. So that one was a little bit more organic because they contacted us, but I think that speaks to when you are involved with organizations, when you have an affiliation, when you are as amazing as you have as amazing of a career as Mary has shared with us and have this reputation that you are an expert in a field and you can bring that to the table. I think it works. I think you have more opportunity when it is associated, right? Like when you are power building with your expertise in the organizations that you work with.
Did you want to jump in, Mary? Otherwise, I can follow up.
Why don't you say something first? And if there's anything left possible to say, I'll say it.
Okay. Again, I would echo, a lot of Nick's points. I think one important point to, really emphasize is it's important to do this, to reach out. I think a lot of times folks don't feel like they have, the expertise to do it. They don't feel like they have the experience. They think about the perfect way to reach out to a policymaker or, the perfect email to send. And, those things aren't really that important. The important thing is doing it, reaching out to try and make these connections, to get more experience talking to policymakers. I've spent a lot of time bringing folks to the Hill to meet with, senators and Congress, representatives, and their staff. There's no, exact perfect way to do it, nor should there be. It depends on the person, the context, the environment, lots of different things. So I think the one of the main things that folks really need to think about is just getting out there more and trying to do it and not worrying so much about getting exactly right. Sometimes it will be, as Nick was saying, cold emails that maybe don't get replies. Other times you'll send an email and you'll get an immediate reply and they'll be, as engaged as they possibly could be. So you just, oftentimes can't know. I would second the advice to, kind of lean on a lot of these affiliations. There's also, work that you can do yourself to, build hooks for your own engagement. So for example, doing an op-ed in your, kind of local news source. Every member of Congress has their staff looking at local news, looking through their clips. Those are usually shared throughout the office. If you, write an op-ed talking about a specific policy and advocating for, your member of Congress to engage on that policy, that's a thing where you might be contacted by that office. You could follow up with the office afterwards saying, I wrote this op-ed, you may have seen it. I'm excited to talk about X or Y. Those folks care greatly about how they're seen in their districts. They're, trying to represent their constituents and the things they're passionate about. So by, building in those hooks, by, creating your own, doors to some extent, I think that's oftentimes things that are kind of undervalued, building in your own mechanisms for reaching out to these offices. It doesn't necessarily have to be something that's occurring. You can be the thing that occurs that facilitates your reason to communicate with these policymakers.
Okay, well, here's what I have to add. I had really pretty much a full-blown panic attack over participating today. And the reason is that I'm a college professor, and there's probably a number of people that are listening that's your job too. Unfortunately, we don't get evaluated or paid to go around doing advocacy. I think it's very important, and I work hard on my own papers and with other people to say, at the very least, disseminate your information so that it gets in the hands of people who can use it in advocacy, so that you've at least taken the steps to translate it from journal language to normal language. You obviously have some items cited more than others, but some of the things I think were most important in terms of policy statements have 20 or 35 citations. You have to do something more to get that message out, because journals aren't just, don't get it done. I think that there are other fields where the scholars have more respect than is true in the social sciences. It's like everybody knows about social science because that's about stuff that just happens to us all every day, right? Whereas, if you're talking about COVID, you tend to go to a researcher or some kind of professor. I find that and others have said this, you have to actively look, you have to, for opportunities, actively write. I've had the advantage of seniority to take some, time to do that, but I feel really bad that we and if for those who are advocates listening, we need to build partnerships, because we have great information, but we don't, we're not trained or expected to move that information to where it can do any good.
Thank you. Our last planned question is, I'm going to ask Steve to respond first. And that is, okay, so you've found the door, you have made the connection, either you've reached out or somebody has reached out to you. What are some good strategies, or do you have any recommendations on how to maintain that connection, how to maintain that influence?
Thanks. I would say, engagement depends on your audience and a wide variety of factors. I think there's a lot of great resources out there explaining, kind of basic advocacy, but there are, a lot of things that are seasonal, for example. So the, annual congressional appropriations process that in regular order follows a very, kind of strict seasonal timeline. So there are, specific times if you want to talk about your, particular program to a member of Congress and why that program needs to be funded. There's times where it's better to do that and times where it's worse to do that. Those are things that I know we were going to put together some resources following this, and a number of folks have sent those along. But those are things that folks should really take advantage of. Kind of piggybacking off of Mary's point a moment ago, one thing I would really recommend that folks take advantage of that they oftentimes do not or are not even aware of is that if you're at a university, you're almost assured that that university has government relations staff. So these staffers have existing familiarity and relationships with policymakers, or your members of Congress, oftentimes your state and or local policymakers or decision makers as well. So it's oftentimes very beneficial to engage these folks regularly to, one, identify actionable components of your work. They spend a lot of time in this research to policy translation space, so they'll oftentimes have a pretty solid eye for identifying what are the parts of your research that apply to policies or kind of policy conversations. They'll be able to help make those connections. They'll be able to help facilitate those. They'll oftentimes be able to support you along the way. So I think government relations staff at universities are one of the most overlooked advocacy resources, especially considering how many folks are coming from the academic world who are trying to do this. And as Mary's saying, they don't always have the experience or the time. Government relations staff can really help fill that gap. And a lot of times I've had a lot of great engagements with government relations folks when I've been in the federal government, outside the federal government. In that work I mentioned previously about election security, we worked with the government relations staff at MIT who are terrific, and helping us connect directly with those researchers, translating some of their work, reaching out to different stakeholders. So those folks are tremendously valuable, and oftentimes are not having researchers reach out to them. I think especially for a lot of kind of social behavioral folks, it's your work applies to so many places that you often don't think about. So working with folks who spend a lot of time thinking about these policy issues already is a good way of kind of doing that. Direct engagement is always effective. So for example, if you've previously engaged someone, a program staffer at a federal agency, and then that agency puts out something like a request for information, you can submit an official response and then follow up with that staffer afterwards to alert them that I sent in this response. Please check it out. Ask if you have any questions. That continues the relationship. When agencies put out these requests for information, I think sometimes it feels on the outside as if they're a black box. You submit the request and then you have done that. But these are taken very seriously. Folks read these. These are part of the decision-making process. There's a lot of attention and focus that goes into reading through these and understanding the evidence that folks are sending in. So take advantage of those. That's another engagement opportunity. And then there are also kind of big administrative and kind of logistical changes that are happening across the federal government. So just in July, the Office of Management and Budget released new guidance detailing steps for federal agencies to take when they're working on regulatory processes. So this is really a two-way street. The federal government and federal policymakers very much want to hear from you, now more than ever. One example from that July guidance actually encourages agencies to collaborate directly with community-based orgs to hold public meetings. So that's a place where you can maybe help facilitate one of those meetings with these federal agencies. So these would allow you to connect directly with policymakers. You could inform their work. You could get feedback. You can also help build bridges, with your community. As Nick was saying, a lot of this is about, building communities, building power, building relationships. All of these things, these connections and bridges that we build move us toward the outcomes that we want to see. So the more engagement we can have, the better. It really helps everyone's work, us on the federal side, non-federal folks state and local level. The more we can continue these conversations, the better. And there's a lot of things that are moving forward. There's a lot of kind of structures being built to allow us to do this better.
Mary, Nick, do you have anything to add on maintaining contact?
Well, I think the only thing that I would say, everything I've heard is undoubtedly true if you weren't in my field. But in my field, I mean, government relations at my university cares about areas that have the potential to bring in big grants. So yeah, we've tried, but we're just not a priority. And in Nick, you work with the military, so these. I guess I'm just saying, I wish there was advice that were for people who either don't work with an organization that is constantly the subject of various legislation, or don't work in a field where there's the possibility of big grant money so that you can get the attention of your university to help you promote. I mean, that's the dilemma I find myself. And everybody that works in the broad field women's issues. That's what we find.
I definitely connect, Mary, with what you're saying about working within an organization that doesn't prioritize this sort of work. I don't have any more specific strategies because I think Steve did such an amazing job of laying those out. I will share this one thing that's a little bit more open-ended or global. When I have conversations around policy with folks, usually people, grad students or earlier career folks, I always tell them it's kind of like what I heard, at least in grad school. You should never email your professor with a question that you can find yourself or find online. And so I say that in the context of when you are trying to continue those relationships once they are established, that you want to think about how you are being a resource to them, right? Like that periodic checking in and continuing the relationship is important, but it does need to be mutually beneficial, kind of as I said earlier, of like, here is my new quote unquote report or my new updates for you on this issue as it relates to these priority areas, like always making that connection, because otherwise, I fear that it could be, right, like enter into that black box that you'll never hear back from or anything. But the more that you invest in that relationship, again, along the line of like you have a priority that you're trying to move forward, I think the more that you will develop that interpersonal connection, which I think is so important to all of this work.
Just quickly to Mary's point, I do want to, really acknowledge that as well. It's kind of malpractice to some extent to not think about all of the, equity related implications across these issues. There are certainly a lot of issues that receive more attention, that have, more resources behind them, that have, gain more attention. So I think that it's one of those things where a lot of policy work oftentimes is thought of as these aha moments, but oftentimes they are, for better or for worse, a slow grind where you have to build these connections over time. So, this administration in particular, equity has been a core focus from day one. With the president's, executive order on equity as soon as the administration began. So I think there's efforts going on, in a lot of state and local levels as well, where folks are trying to build a lot of the infrastructure to, support a lot of work on, kind of women's issues and gender equity, on a lot of other kind of, equity focused issues where we are, in many cases, tremendously behind. But the slow grinding in many cases is continuing. And so continuing to have those conversations. There are, I could say, many folks across the federal agencies very interested in these issues, working towards these issues, addressing a lot of them. Just for example, with CHIPS and Science, the large, kind of science investment that passed, one of the things, there was a focus of that was a focus around gender and equity issues in S&T, and what we can do to address those, how we can reduce gender and sexual based harassment. So there's a lot of ongoing work there as well. But it's the ensuring that we're not losing focus on a lot of these, kind of equity issues, and just, kind of assuming that is a level playing field for every issue in every context, and people are coming from communities with the same level of resources. We know that's not always the case, and so it's important to bring that up as well. So thanks, Mary.
Thank you. It's now time for our Q&A. We have a few questions in the Q&A box, and some of them I think are often about language. Do you have any particular resources or any kind of help in terms of like how do we talk in a way that is effective? So we have some questions about that. Are there particular courses or trainings that help prepare psychologists for advocacy? So in general, a couple of questions about how do we really do this translation in a bit more nuts, and in a bit more detail.
Right. Steve, can I put a little asterisk on your question as our speakers are talking about this? A number of people send in questions ahead of time, so we had a chance to go through the questions. So all of you who sent in your questions early, thank you. We went through those questions, and it seems to me that part of what you're asking about, Richard, is as you come up with these strategies and talking to students, is that many parts of the country are really very politically conservative right now. And so there's a lot of concern about how you formulate your strategies knowing that there's going to be this kind of pushback. And I think Mary and Nick in particular have probably experienced this in the work that they're doing. So maybe as you're talking about the best ways to get started, how to work with students, develop courses, we might think about the larger political climate and how that influences your strategies.
We'll open it up to any of our panelists in response to that. Any part of that.
I can just make a quick comment that I think Nick mentioned it earlier, but a lot of times, you know, it's a combination of balancing your focus on, you know, empirical evidence and your narrative. I think a lot of times the issues that we're talking about are, you know, kind of shared, you know, among most people you're talking to. Most people want economic opportunity. They want to be treated fairly. They want to have access to healthcare. I think it's not always a given that the person you're speaking to will share your, you know, political ideology or background. I think that's the case, you know, even for, you know, all of us, regardless of what you're working on. But I think the more you kind of lean into those, you have a compelling narrative that really identifies how this impacts actual human beings in their lives. And then you also have, you know, this research basis to show, you know, how we know this. I think, again, we can't always expect these, you know, kind of aha moments, you know, like on TV where you have this one perfect meeting with the policymaker and it changes their mind, you know, 180. A lot of times it's, you know, slow grind, going and forging relationships with these folks, really trying to connect with them, talking to them, and then seeing, you know, kind of change over time. It would be great if, you know, we could see, you know, policy happen overnight, but it's oftentimes, it's a process, you know, really trying to engage these folks and seeing change over time. It's oftentimes there's no easy answer. It can be difficult as well personally for a lot of folks to go into, you know, what they feel is an unwelcome environment. So there's oftentimes, you know, kind of resources you can rely on, either community orgs or you know, kind of other, you know, kind of online infrastructure as well to, you know, connect with folks who are trying to do similar things. But it is very challenging, but it's something that's it's very important. So it's always great when folks are able to do so, because it really helps us, you know, kind of slowly push forward on some of these things.
I'll jump in. I'll echo what Steve was saying about kind of looking at the different ways that one can use their expertise and their research to advocate. I think what I have shared today, kind of in reflection, was really focused on how you can be the individual that goes into the room and says the things, right? And like, that's not always like what's needed. I think we societally are very much, or many of us are very much like, all right, how are we going to do this thing, or how are we going to represent it? But being a part of the movement, being part of the work, I think is equally important. And we don't really acknowledge that in the same way. I think when we focus on like, all right, I need to prepare for this meeting, be the one that speaks and says these things. So I think that it's important for us to acknowledge the various pathways and opportunities that Steve had mentioned around like how we can get involved in this work, because it's going to take a collective, right? Like, it's not going to be any individual person or any individual organization to really move the policies forward that I assume that our circle of trust all here kind of agree upon or want to move forward. The other kind of thing that came to mind when I thought about talking specifically about policy and just in general, although I'm totally a rambler and I'm very aware of that. When I was in DC, I actually engaged with Toastmasters. They're not paying me to say this by any means, but you know, it's a local community-based organization that you can go and like learn more about public speaking and get practice and exercise and community support. And I just think that has always stood out to me, because when I connected with them, it really helped me kind of prepare in a lot of my professional capacities. So if that is the role that you want to be in, I think that is an excellent resource to look into. And then the last thought I had was on the translation piece. I think when I came out of, when I went to DC and did the fellowship, I stayed for a few more years before I left, I walked away like really thinking about translation, like how are we translating our research to policymakers? And I think that the conversation or the question that this was based on is more broad, like how are we translating our research at every level so that the communities that we're researching with can utilize that and understand it, so that policymakers at every level can understand what we're asking for and what the research really means. There are so many different pathways to do that. I think Mary really highlighted an excellent opportunity in the op-eds and in the slides that she shared with us at the beginning. There are different ways for us to to translate and to communicate our research messages, that I think really goes back to that. I know I said this earlier, but the building of power and building of movement towards the change that we want to see. And as Steve had said, everything takes time.
Thank you. We have about 5 minutes left, and we have a few closing remarks. So this is the time. If you have any, if you going out the door, do you have any like one last thought or anything you would like to emphasize? We'll just open it up to whatever part of this conversation that you would like to underline or add to, at least to make a point.
I have a question, Steve.
Yeah.
What do you do when legislation gets passed? And like any legislation, it's an experiment that's implemented before it was conducted. And unintended effects are discovered. So when that legislation comes up for renewal, you want changes in it. However, there are now entrenched groups of people who have benefited from the legislation as passed, and you find yourself in a position where pressure is put on you not to advocate for change because you will undermine the entire legislation. Tell me about situations like that. How do people handle fixing legislation, not getting it passed in the first place?
I mean, I guess it depends on the kind of size and scope of the bill. I think this conversation is the case for every piece of legislation. Even if you're talking about an initial piece of legislation being passed, before that piece of legislation was passed, there was an infrastructure that existed. There were stakeholders, there were entrenched interests previously. So a lot of that is, still the same, regardless of, kind of whether that passed or not. I think a lot of times it's trying to navigate that process, working with, kind of partners, working, as Nick was saying, your community of folks who are, equally engaged or invested in this, and, trying to push forward the tweaks that you think are meaningful. I think there's always that conversation about, will this piece of legislation fall apart if we try and make this change? I think that's something that every bill has kind of gone through at some point. I think the goal is always to get the best, piece of legislation out that you can. It may not always be perfect, but the more you can push it towards that, I think is usually the right approach. There's always going to be that, kind of push and pull about kind of who are winners and losers, and kind of what tweaks a piece of legislation makes. But that shouldn't stop you from trying to make positive changes to a bill, particularly when we know the evidence has shown that something does not work or is effective. I think that's a thing where we need to continue pushing forward toward evidence-based policy and doing the best we can there.
Yeah, because that's what's really dismayed me, is for how long we've been putting out meta-analysis showing that certain approaches do not work, but they keep getting funded over and over again because the persons you are all talking about cultivating do tend to spend more attention to those people who pester them a lot, to those people who tell a lot of compelling stories, and they don't spend as much attention to people who just say, but look at this is what you find when you actually examine the evaluation of this type of policy. So in a way, I'm almost turning around and saying, how do we educate legislators to better take in a depth of information so that they're not always, somebody once told me any bill named after a person is a bad bill.
Well, on that note, I think we're going to have to close it. We have a couple of things to wrap up. One is, again, in the chat, there is a link to our toolkit, our policy toolkit. Some resources and some links have been provided by our panelists today, and previous webinars in this series also have toolkit documents there. So please check that out in the chat and look for that information in future emails. The last thing is a little note that our next webinar in this series, webinar 4, is called Slaying Trolls, Navigating Your Online Presence When Doing Controversial Policy Relevant Research. Slaying Trolls. That's going to be Tuesday, October 3rd, from 12 to 1 Eastern on October 3rd. So we hope to see you there for that event. That's definitely an important part of engaging the public and engaging in public policy. So thank you all, our panelists. Thank you so much. I really heard a number of important things, and I really appreciate your time and your experience. Thank you very much.
Thanks. So.